reading today is from Genesis 39, chapters 1 through 23, verses 1 through 23. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down here. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of the Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and field, so that he left all he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there he had no concern for anything but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome and good-looking. And after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to the master's wife, "Look, with me here my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except himself, because you are his wife. Now then, could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out loudly. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Then she kept his garment by her until the master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." When the master heard the words of his wife, he spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant has treated me." He became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph care of all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever was done there, he was the one who did. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper.
Will you join me in prayer? Holy, loving God, bless our words, our thoughts, and our reflections, that they might be a blessing to you and all that you love. Amen. As I grew up, as a family, we listened to classic country and musical theater. And my nieces carried on the tradition and have been a part of several community theater shows. Both have been involved in the show Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's one of my mother's all-time favorites. Hi, Mom. I have an unpopular opinion and think it's hokey. Really, the only song out of the whole show I like is that ballad in the middle where Joseph is, in the scenes that we are in, singing that every door would be closed to him, but God is still with the people of Israel. Now, following the narrative lectionary as we are seeing stories in order, but with huge leaps from one story to the next. So, last week, we saw Abraham and the promises that God made to Abraham and all of his descendants. And Abraham and his wife Sarah waited, often and patiently, for the birth of their son Isaac. Isaac married Rebekah. Rebekah gave birth to twin boys, Esau, who was hairy and muscular and manly, and the second being Jacob, with smooth skin and finer features, and he liked to hang out with his mother. And it was Jacob who received the blessing from Isaac, although it was supposed to be Esau. It was Jacob for whom the promises were going to carry forward. Jacob had 2 wives. The one he loved the most, Rachel, and the one he had to marry, Leah, who was so unloved, we don't even have a picture of her. For many years, Rachel couldn't bear children, and Leah, the unloved one, bore many. It was Leah's firstborn son who should carry on the promises of God given to Abraham and all of his descendants. Instead, it was the firstborn son of Jacob's favorite wife, Joseph. He was nearly the youngest, and perhaps he was more like Jacob than any of the others. Jacob had dreams of power and authority over his brothers. Jacob was given gifts, like a fancy coat with long sleeves, maybe colorful, by their father. And one day, Joseph's brothers found him in a field, beat him, and sold him to traveling Bedouins, and told their father that he had been killed. That is where our story begins. They took Joseph to Egypt, and they sold him as a slave. Joseph was blessed beyond expectations, beyond the place in his family was expected by his father. And Joseph was blessed beyond expectations as a slave, what was expected as a slave in an Egyptian household. Joseph was given responsibilities and privileges. Much like it had been in his father's house, it was taken away from him there too. Now, I have a very clear memory of when I was in college. This will connect, I swear. I was sitting at a lunch table in the cafeteria with some of my guy friends. And they said, well, we wouldn't pursue dating you because we really respect the person you're dating. And I think I was supposed to be flattered that they were interested. But I also was super confused because if they liked and respected him so much, what are they saying about what they think about me? And I've thought about this over the years, and I'm smarter now that I'm older and I've had time to think and consider things, that this offhanded comment at a lunch table has left me wondering about people, about bodies, about who gets to own them. Because here's the thing, Potiphar's wife doesn't even get a name. She seems to be part of a long legacy of stories, of tropes about evil and seductive women. In the story immediately before this, Joseph's niece-in-law, Tamar, used her sexuality to carry on the family name, and she is named a hero. She is in the legacy of Jesus, part of his lineage. Potiphar's wife is a villain. trying to take down a good man, Joseph, who never seems to do anything wrong. And we can see our story in a lot of stories. Joseph was of a different ethnic community than Egypt. He was a lower economic status. In fact, he was a slave. It's possible one of the reasons that made Joseph so attractive was that he was like his father, that he had the finer features that made him look a little more feminine than what men might have been expected to look like in the day. And there's a whole lot of language around that pertaining to his fancy coat and what it means when it said he was handsome, or could be translated as fine of form and features. But that is completely a different sermon or conversation. But all of these pieces make our stories really difficult because I will always question how women are portrayed in our scriptures. To be fair, how anyone is portrayed in our scripture, especially when they're trying to make someone look like a villain, because villains have to be clearly defined. And Potiphar's wife is our villain. And as an aside, I went looking for art on this story, and it is very difficult to find images in art of Potiphar's wife not naked, because villainesses are naked when they're seducing. So I wonder, what was the role of Potiphar's wife in society or in her family? What kind of power did she have or not have? Was she too owned by her husband like Joseph? How do we think about Potiphar's wife depends solely on how she's described by those telling the story, who are trying very hard to make a point of who Joseph is and his role in the larger narratives. It makes our biblical stories complicated and exciting and filled with opportunities to study and dig deep and see perspectives. Did the story happen just like this? Who knows? But does it happen all of the time? Kind of. Because we live in a time when someone would say there's no such thing as a man being sexually harassed, as if being pursued by a woman is always okay if you're a man. It's not. And if we were to switch the genders to make it Potiphar and Josephine, we would see clearly that this kind of workplace harassment exists in our world and is never okay. We live in a time where false accusations of rape are made, but they're certainly not made at the rate that they are emphasized when we look at them. And we live with a history where white women made accusations of rape against Black men that might lead to those men's imprisonment, like Joseph, but more often to their murder. This story happens, has happened, will probably happen again. Our biblical stories are true because they speak of the human experience, of what it means to be human and what it means to live on this earth and how we respond to evil and injustice. In our story, Joseph is almost written as too good, possibly naive. Maybe that's what his brothers saw in him and why they couldn't stand having him around. It seemed that everything was so easy for Joseph. Everything was good. Everything that was good just seemed to fall into his lap. And in their eyes, the world needed to be set right. That Joseph needed to be put in his proper place, the proper order in his family and society, at least in the eyes of his brothers. Now, Potiphar had given Joseph power and responsibility. And one of the things about power is that a little bit of power calls you to a little bit more power. And that power calls you to a little bit more. Perhaps our story and our story with Potiphar's wife is a symbol of all of the things that try to call us to power, to taking the things that aren't ours and to receive them as if they are. The reason Joseph isn't seduced by the power in his life, it seems to be that he is grounded in his understanding of God. Joseph is grounded in the reality that he is not alone and that God is with him, and that to use that power to take and acquire more, to take what wasn't actually his, what wasn't given, was a sin against God and everything that God has made. But Joseph was still blessed. Now, there's a thing that happened a few years ago. It may still be happening, where folks would put a picture on the internet of them in their lives and caption it blessed. Maybe they were going on a fancy trip, or their family, their big family, all had huge smiles on their faces like they never fight ever. Or they got something really fancy like the big TV or the really great car, and they're like, hashtag blessed, I'm so blessed. As if one, blessing is something you show off, and two, blessing is something only for yourself. See, one of my favorite stories that comes out of Methodism is that the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, when he lived at a time when people would literally stand on soapboxes in the middle of sidewalks or fields and preach. And one day, John was preaching. He preached that the world was his parish, and so he could do that anywhere and not be bound by the walls of a church, despite what the Church of England wanted him to do. And while he was out one day preaching about those who have much, particularly those with much money, ought to use it for the good of others, passing by one day was one Arthur Guinness, who had a lot and was so moved by this preacher that he started a brewery as his way to give back much of what he had been given. In the earliest days of the Guinness Brewing Company, the company would send every employee and their family on a week or two holiday to the shore every year. In addition to the health care and the free vacations, there were free meals, a monthly beer allowance, and a pension. Arthur Guinness understood to be blessed was to be a blessing. Joseph is the first one we see living into the promises of Abraham that God gave Abraham that we talked about last week. That says that Abraham and his descendants will be a blessing, will be blessed and will be a blessing to all of the nations. And Joseph, instead of taking that blessing to acquire more, he lived in a way that it would be shared. That even those who could be seen as an enemy, who were keeping him as a slave, were also blessed. Even when he has power, because our story is going to carry on when he is only second to Pharaoh. He uses his position and the power that he had been given to benefit all of the people, all of Israel and his family who comes looking for help, his own family who betrayed him. I think about Joseph being blessed in all of these positions of power, but also being blessed and God with him in those moments in the prison. Now, Several years ago, there was a song, it's probably been 2 decades, a couple years ago, a song by Nicole Nordman, and it's a prayer. And in it, she is remembering all of the things that God has done, the parting of the seas, the sending of dreams, the closing the mouths of lions. And in the bridge, she sings, "Oh, praise and all the honor be to the God of ancient mysteries, whose every sign and wonder turn the pages of our history. But tonight my heart is heavy, and I cannot keep from whispering that this prayer, are you there? Oh, great God, be small enough to hear me now." And I think about Joseph in prison, in a small moment, needing a God who just shows up. And how often that's our lives too. See, even when things became difficult for Joseph, when his freedom was taken away, even when he was tempted with something easy and simple, even when he had been rejected by his family, he was rooted in the understanding that he was blessed to be a blessing. Joseph doesn't live to curse his brothers so that all others might be cursed, but lives in a way that will make space for them to come together again. Everything rooted in knowing that God is with him and that he is walking with God and being a blessing no matter where he is. And it is awareness in the moment and in the times of trial and difficult times that he is not alone. It's like Joseph took a breath and said a prayer and made the next step. It's why we called this week, you'll see it on the other things, to keep calm and carry on. Take a breath, say a prayer, take a step. Rest in God, be a blessing. Now, our biblical narratives are filled with people who are not so good. They're not always filled with people like Joseph who follow God without question, who follow the path and stick to it. Sometimes we have brothers responding in jealousy, and in a couple of weeks we will find David, who is so seduced by the power that he claims to own somebody that was not his to own, and then kills her husband. And there are consequences for these actions, for giving into seduction and the seduction of power. But in our story about Joseph also tells us that you can do everything right, and the world can still be full of evil, and you can't control the world around you. You can only control what you do with it. God was with Joseph when he was at home in his father's house, and God was with Jacob, that was a mistake. God was with Joseph when he was sold by his brothers, and God was with Joseph when he was enslaved, and God was with Joseph in prison, and God was with Joseph when he was serving the Pharaoh. And God was with Joseph at his highest points and at the lowest points of Joseph's life. Being good doesn't prevent bad things from happening to Joseph. But in the stories to come, we will see that by not doing good, God is still with them, which is not an invitation to be seduced by the powers, but just to acknowledge it doesn't matter. In good or in bad, in struggles or in joy, God's presence is with God's people always. You are not alone. You could do everything right and still struggle. And you could give in to all the powers of the world, and God is still with you. And that no matter what, we are to remember that you are not alone. You are loved by God, always, and no matter. So the question then is, how can you be a blessing? How can you live in a way that brings goodness to the lives of those around you? You are not alone. Even as you may hope for the partings of seas and the givings of dreams, sometimes God is found in small moments, in small blessings, in a gift from a friend or a moment of kindness, in a smile from a stranger. All of those are blessings too. Sometimes God is found in responsibility, in you being gifted with an opportunity and responsibility to be a blessing, to bless your neighbors near and far. And when God seems far off, may you find God in a friend, in your church family. May you find God in each other. Even when it seems like you couldn't be further from blessings, even if you've never have a moment that is postable to whatever on the internet that you would caption, #blessed. Breathe in, say a prayer, take a step. You are not alone. You are blessed by the Creator who is small enough to be with you in those quiet times and who is great enough to be with you always. Breathe in, say a prayer. You are blessed to be a blessing, no matter where you are. Amen. Amen.